you're finally getting your useEffect rant. And I think I have to defend it a bit. useEffect was a very important change in how we think about and use React. Before hooks, all of your application's state was defined directly in relationship to the life cycle of your components. So when you had a counter, you would use that counter and update that counter inside of state bindings to the class itself, rather than bindings directly to the state. The thing that hooks changed that is, to be frank, almost magical, is they abstracted the state lifecycle out of the component so that state itself has a life cycle. When you define a use state, when you define a use effect, when you define these things, while they are related to the component's lifecycle, they are not directly tied to it. Every component update doesn't force your hook to rerun unless the data that your hook depends on has changed. These patterns are a huge part of why hooks were so magical, because they let us define external, reusable state management and life cycles around those state values, because those were no longer tied directly to the component. Saw Ryan, the creator of Solid.js, in chat mention that this is not a new idea, and he's absolutely correct. What is new about the idea, though, is how well integrated it was within React. The combination of JSX, reusable stateful parts, and workflows to combine those in something as big as React was insane. And honestly, if hooks happened before React was popular, I don't know if it would have caught on. React components, while a meaningful abstraction from the MVC model that caused Angular to die and React to succeed, they were similar enough to OOP patterns and behaviors that we understood before. Honestly, thanks to things like Java, that the React class component model worked well enough and was similar enough to what we were used to. Once React had taken over more, the move to the functional patterns and to moving the lifecycle out of the component and into the state more directly was possible and bold. And because the code snippet looking at them left to right made React with hooks look and read so much better, it was obvious that we were going to move to that. And I think a lot of the patterns that the community had built in the class components like world, like hawks, like render props, all these weird ways of abusing JSX and wrappers to try and get data to components, I don't think hooks would have been as well adopted, understood, built, and loved if it wasn't for the history of React before them. And I think that now, if we look at hooks and we look at them compared to how something like Solid.js works, we're going to feel a little frustrated that React isn't that great. But the reason we have the conversation at all is because of hooks forcing us out of the old mindset where a component is where the state lives. Hooks prove to us that the lifecycle of our data does not have to live entirely as the lifecycle of our component, and that we can build our own relationships between those things. There is so much value in that we're having all new conversations that we couldn't have before. I loved what I saw with Solid.js when it was first announced. I see Ryan in chat agreeing with all this, which is awesome. And I don't think I could have had the solid conversation with my coworkers if it wasn't for React forcing it via hooks. Like, one of the painful parts of useEffect is that it isn't tied to your component's lifecycle the way that people were used to. But we also need to have a way to bind things to a lifecycle. And thinking in that way is hard. And the combination of useEffect being a component lifecycle thing as well as a data lifecycle thing is complex. I think it's time to Excalibur a bit. Let's get a new one in defense of useEffect. So let's focus more on useEffect. Let's write out a quick example useEffect. Effect. Console.log. Count is count. Nice, simple useEffect. Let's talk about what this does first. When you instantiate this, you're creating a function that runs whenever things in this array change. What is unintuitive about this is that one of those change states is when the component is mounted. So the first time this mounts, it will run. And then if count ever changes, it will run again. The confusing part of this is you're defining this around the data. So we are binding this to count, but we're also binding it to the component, because if the component mounts, then it will run this when it mounts. And if it unmounts and remounts, even if count itself didn't change, this hook is deleted and reinstantiated. So a useEffect hook inside of a component is binding it's building a relationship between the component's lifecycle and the data's lifecycle. Now, when the data changes, this runs, and when the component unmounts and remounts, it runs. There's also, and I should probably put this in the example, return console.log unmounting. So when this code now, or when this component is unmounted, the return here runs instead. What is incredibly unintuitive about this, and this is a thing that React likes to do, is there are a lot of implicit behaviors here. The first implicit behavior, is this going to become a rant about explicit and implicit behaviors? I'm just going to do a list of all of the configurations you can make with useEffect. So things you can do. Things you can do with useEffect. You can run on every render, run on mount and unmount, run when a value changes. And all of these things are very different behaviors. And all of them are hidden under weird syntax. So for run on every render, we we don't return an array. We don't give a second argument. So for this first behavior, if you want this to run every time the component renders, you delete this. If you want to run on mount and unmount, the weird part of that is the unmount. If you return a function in a useEffect, that gets called on unmount. That is strange. That is a weird behavior. And if you want to run on when a value changes, you have to pass it to the array here. However, if that value is not serializable in an easy comparison, like it's not a string, a number, or a Boolean, then you need to take the object or whatever it is and memoize that at creation so it doesn't fail in a quality check when the useEffect runs, which is another implicit behavior you're expected to understand about useEffect. It also, as I mentioned before, runs on mount, whatever you put in here, which is also implicit. And the cleanup also runs when the value changes too. None of these things are communicated when you look at a useEffect. To be fair, this is probably the simplest you can write it, but I would have loved like an alternative syntax maybe. That is useEffect on mount, not I shouldn't say on mount. I should say maybe it takes a function for the first thing. Console.log main thing count. And then in here we could have deps be an array, maybe even make it mandatory. Something I suggested is maybe if you really want the always re-render behavior, pass true here. Now it always re-renders. Do something like that. But having the default behavior when you delete that be something as unintuitive as constant re-renders sucks. We could have like deps on unmount, or not, I guess on unmount is not right. Cleanup is an optional function that does whatever. Cleaning up. You can even have a separate on mount if you want to. But the idea is by not giving these things named keys of some form, we now have absurd implicit behaviors that are not very intuitive. I don't think this is necessarily significantly better, and we should go write like helpful or go write helpers to do things this way instead. However, not having the API behaviors clear at all means somebody who hasn't written React before looks at this and has no idea what it's doing. Someone who's written a lot of React before shrugs and immediately knows. I think that when you combine the weird syntax with the weird mindset of state being around, or of life cycles around state being tied to life cycles around components, and then you combine that with the additional weird behaviors of strict mode around things running more than one time, the result is a lot of confusion and a lot of reasonable issues that people run into regularly. I think it's important to recognize how much of your problem is with useEffect being weird versus useEffect being painfully implicit with its behavior versus actually being a bad pattern. I find that when people complain about useEffect, they're usually complaining about one specific aspect here. It might actually be okay with or fond of the other aspects. I think the compromises around these weird behaviors are all annoying and whatnot, but I think the overall ability to build life cycles around your state is super, super powerful. That all said, there's a lot of ways you should never ever use useEffect. This is probably going to be the noob-friendly portion. Please do not use effect for, let's list a bunch of these things, for updating state. Derive it. So if you want to have, let's say you have a counter, and when the counter increases, you want to also change double counter. So you every time you click, it increases count by 1, but you also want to show what double that count is. I've seen people write a second use state for that doubled count, and then in an effect, when count changes, set double count to the new value. You can just multiply the value when you're rendering it, or just define a variable underneath the use state. It's fine. You don't need to set a second value and a useEffect and do another render cycle every time a value changes. Please don't do that, actually. It's much worse. useEffect should not be used to trigger chains of things like that. So, given that like updating state should not be done through an effect, I should say given. So yeah, this should not be done through an effect. Other things that probably shouldn't be done through an effect: data fetching, React query, and such are cool. Data fetching is something I've seen a lot of people do in effects. When the component mounts, they want to trigger an async data fetch, update some state. It's not that useEffect is the wrong thing for that. It's that there's a lot of potential footguns and things to lose if you build your own effect there, and you should probably use a better external solution for that. What else do I see useEffect used for that it probably shouldn't be? Actions of any form. One that I've seen, and I talked about this before, there was a really, really bad bug inside of the Twitch dashboard where whenever certain users open the dashboard, it would immediately trigger an ad on the channel. The reason for that was rather than, so actually I have the button here. So when you click the add button, which by the way, I'm going to click right now because pre-rolls are running and I want viewers to keep coming in. They're going down. I want them to go up. So I'm sorry if you get an ad right now. Subscribe so you don't in the future. When I click this button, the state changes to executing. If I was to edit the actions during that and save it, it would have been saved in the executing state. And when I click the button, it doesn't trigger the action. When I click the button, it triggers a state change to switch the button from the triggerable button to the execution button. And in the execution button, there's a useEffect so that when it mounts, it runs the action, which means that my click didn't trigger the action. The rendering of the button triggered the action. And when you save the state here, it can actually, and it does this, persists the state of the entire thing to local storage, which includes the execution state, which means when I refresh the page, if it saves in that state, it will automatically run it out of my channel. Because you have used an effect for an action rather than a user action for an action. When a user clicks a thing, the on click should trigger what you want. The on-click shouldn't trigger a state that triggers an effect that then triggers what you want. Those things are unrelated. And you need to be more considerate when you are building your applications and the actions within them, that those actions are tied to what users do, not to what your app does. So the point I was trying to make is that your actions being in a useEffect is not just a foot gun. It is actively risking the architecture of your code base. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of what effects are for. Do or bind to user actions. Cool. So with all of these things not being good for effects, what are they good for? It seems like this covered a lot. Well, there are actually a lot of good use cases for effects that we should be considerate of. Please use effects for event listeners. Event listeners are a great use case for useEffect. Let's say when a component mounts, you want to create an event listener that keeps track of a certain click event type. And on unmount, you want to clean that up. useEffect's a great pattern for that. For synchronizing state, but seriously, use React query if you can. So like if you want to connect to a WebSocket server on mount and disconnect on unmount, effects are a good way to do that. Probably one of the better ones. I like to use external solutions when I can that aren't as directly tied to React, but if you can't, and you often can't, event listeners, bindings to external clients, things like that, effects are really good for. Yeah, you might not need an effect. This is the official beta React.js documentation. I'll link this in the description for the video. That helps describe a lot of the ways you can remove unnecessary effects from your application. Oh, look, it's one of the ones I talked about earlier, where it's setting full name whenever first name and last name change. Do not do this. Just calculate it. Look at that. Ta-da. So simple. And you can cache expensive calculations with use memo. Here's an example of that here. So yeah, if you're concerned recalculating every time is slow, use memo. Now you're done. Resetting all state when a prop changes. Keys are really good for this. Does he show keys for that? No. Well, you can use a key on a parent to force all of the state to die, which is very useful. Setting post requests. This is an analytics event. Here's the one I was talking about. Here's what Twitch did that caused many really bad outages in the dashboard. Don't do this. It's very bad. Also important, if you do something like this where on mount you're doing a post, you need to be cool with this firing hundreds of times erroneously. If you're not cool with this thing just going off fucking constantly, don't do this because it's dangerous. And we have the handle submit, which this is a function, handle submit, that does this submit. This should happen when you bind it to an on-click and that on-click is fired. That shouldn't happen when other things change. I see people in chat bringing up Remix. Remix solves the need for useEffect the same way React Query does. It makes it, it solves it most of the same way React Query does, in the sense that it gives you the data in the component and it doesn't require you to define your own fetching logic. useEffect, a lot of the things people are pushing back on are saying like, but you don't need useEffect in X, are literally just the data fetching portion. Like, yeah, useEffect for data fetching isn't ideal, and if you can get data another way, you should. But if you can't, useEffect is fine. It's not great, but it works. Generally, I think React Query is going to be a much better developer experience, and you could argue use query should be built into React at this point. Possible. I'd hear the argument. But generally, I think that useEffect doesn't feel as necessary in a Remix code base because React Query is so deeply, or something, I shouldn't say React Query, but something very similar to it is so deeply built into the Remix ecosystem. But just for data fetching from the server. As soon as you want to, in a Remix app, fetch your active devices for your like AV layer. Let's say you want to turn on your webcam on a Remix site. Remix is not going to help you there. None of Remix's APIs are going to let you interact with that. You're just writing React again. Cool. So what else is useEffect for? Are there other examples of what you should use it for in here? Initializing with it is bad. I like this. I do this too much where I bind something externally. Yep, I do this a lot too, running outside. I feel like people put things inside of effects that should be outside of components pretty often, which hurts. Like your code does not need to be inside of a React component to run. JavaScript runs. If you call JavaScript outside of your component, that code is going to run. You can do that. Oh, yep. Also bad. Just pass that down and call both. Yep, correct. All of these are really good examples. None of these are how to actually use it. I like the ignore example in this, actually. I do really like this example. It, rather than using a cancellation, it updates this value such that if this async function comes through out of order, it will not use that value. Somebody links synchronizing with effects. That's this guy. Cool. Cool. So this is one where, because you can't start playing a video until after the first render, this effect will run after that first render and then trigger the play. What is Maple saying is a banger take? Yeah. Oh, using React, you get tunnel vision and forget there's a world outside of components. Yeah, absolutely. I've seen that a ton where people just forget JavaScript runs outside of React. And I think useEffect and a lot of the misuses of useEffect have fallen into that. Yep. I do not like not passing an array to your useEffect, just generally. Yeah, these articles are good. The chat room one, I'm pumped he added this because I definitely inspired this. Yeah, create connection, connection.connect. You probably want it to disconnect. Yep. And here, this actually explains that it runs multiple times. That's cool. Controlling non-React widgets. Yeah, if you can't just bind those other ways, sure, but it is okay for that. Yeah. useEffect is good if you use it for the right things. useEffect is bad if you use it for the wrong things. Hooks are cool. I love what you can do with them. And I feel like the complaints I hear aren't necessarily acknowledging what hooks did right and how important it is to build good life cycles and how powerful it is to have your state management and your state life cycles built in these reusable pieces. There's so much value in the way that that hooks allow us to architect and think about state, and useEffect is one of the most important pieces to enable that. That does not mean it solves every problem. In fact, it means we have to be more cautious of which problems we try to solve with it. But if we do use it correctly, we can make incredible things. So yeah, fantastic stuff in the React community. useEffect, as painful as it can be, is a really powerful primitive, and I would not trade it for component did mount and component should update ever. You will never get me back on those patterns ever again. Cool. This is a fun one.